My name is Aiden. I'm 42 years old. I work in the legal department at Bay Financial Group, which my mother-in-law Margaret knew about, but she never realized I actually had a law degree. Given my personality, I don't talk much about myself. She probably had no idea. Margaret is what you'd call a control-type person. She's the kind who has to make every family decision herself, the kind who believes she always knows what's best for everyone. When Uncle Walter left us his Tampa Beach house, what I learned later was that she had been planning to steal this property from the very beginning. Her greed was already in motion, but she disguised it perfectly. Coastal property is so complicated, Aiden. Insurance, taxes, maintenance. Maybe I should handle the paperwork, she said with that helpful tone that fooled everyone. I just smiled and nodded. That's what I do. Last Saturday, she walked into our house with a fake lawyer and a stack of legal documents. I brought Todd, our family attorney, she announced. Time to transfer this house to a proper family trust. She slid papers across our coffee table. Just sign here. It's really for your protection. The guy in the wrinkled suit was sweating bullets. My wife Claire looked mortified. Everyone knows you're not equipped for this kind of responsibility, Margaret said, her voice getting sharper. These decisions require real expertise. I sat there 42 years old being lectured about my own incompetence in the house my uncle specifically left to me. Margaret smiled like she'd already won. That's when I calmly opened my laptop and showed her the security footage. Margaret, before you say another word, you should probably see this. Crystal clear images of her using copied keys to break into our house. Going through our private documents. Photographing our financial information. Her confident expression started cracking as she realized what she was looking at. There's something else you should know about me. And then came the hidden truth: Margaret's massive debt, nearly $400,000 she'd been hiding. But most shocking of all was realizing that my mother-in-law had no idea who she'd been trying to con this entire time. I'm a lawyer. The room went dead silent. The fake lawyer bolted for the door. Margaret's face went white as she finally understood the true identity of the son-in-law she'd always underestimated. She'd been planning this for weeks. Unauthorized entries, fake assessments, forged documents, all because she was desperate to escape a financial hole she'd dug herself into. But here's what really scared me: how close she came to pulling it off. How many families out there can't fight back against this kind of manipulation? If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let's get started. The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows of the Tampa apartment, casting long shadows across the small table where Aiden Mitchell sat with his coffee. At 42, he had learned to value quiet mornings before the day's responsibilities began. Legal documents were spread before him in neat piles: estate paperwork, insurance forms, property deeds. The methodical organization came naturally after 15 years working in corporate law. First at a downtown firm, then in the legal department at Bay Financial Group. The envelope from the probate attorney lay open beside his laptop. Uncle Walter's final gift: a weathered beach house on stilts, 3 miles from their apartment, facing the Gulf of Mexico. Claire emerged from the bedroom, pulling her dark hair into a ponytail. At 40, she moved with the efficient energy of someone managing both a part-time teaching position and most of their household logistics. Coffee's fresh, Aiden said without looking up from the property assessment report. Thanks. Claire poured her cup and studied the papers scattered across their table. Still can't believe Walter left us the house. He always said it should stay in the family. Your family, Claire corrected gently. My mother's already made it clear she has opinions about what we should do with it. Aiden's pen paused over the insurance documentation. Margaret's phone call yesterday had been predictably intrusive, wrapped in concern that felt more like criticism. She's just worried, he said, though they both knew Margaret's worry usually translated into unsolicited advice and thinly veiled suggestions about their decision-making capabilities. She thinks we can't handle it. She thinks I can't handle it, Aiden corrected. There's a difference. The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Aiden glanced at the caller ID and sighed. Speak of the devil, Claire murmured. Aiden answered on the third ring. Good morning, Margaret. Aiden, dear. Margaret's voice carried the practiced warmth she used when delivering unwelcome advice. I've been thinking about your inheritance situation. Have you considered all the complications that come with coastal property? Aidan switched to speakerphone so Claire could listen. We're reviewing everything carefully. I'm sure you are. But these old beach houses. They're money pits, really. The insurance alone could bankrupt you, and that's before you factor in storm damage, foundation issues, constant maintenance. Margaret paused, allowing her warnings to settle. I'd hate to see you get in over your heads. We appreciate your concern, Aidan replied evenly. Of course. I just think you might want to consider your options while the market is still good. Coastal properties are selling well right now, but that could change quickly if we have a bad hurricane season. Claire's expression tightened. Margaret's suggestions always followed the same pattern: identify a problem, magnify the risks, propose solutions that coincidentally benefited Margaret's perspectives. We haven't decided anything yet, Aidan said. Well, don't wait too long. These opportunities don't last forever. And if you need help navigating the paperwork, I do have experience with property transactions through my real estate connections. After Margaret hung up, the kitchen felt smaller somehow. Claire refilled her coffee and sat across from Aidan, her face showing the familiar mixture of frustration and resignation that appeared whenever her mother inserted herself into their decisions. She wants us to sell, Claire said. She wants to help us sell, Aidan corrected. Which means she wants a commission or consultation fee. They drove to the beach house after breakfast. Walter's cottage stood exactly where it had for 30 years, gray shingles weathered by salt air, white trim that needed painting but still looked respectable. The front porch faced the Gulf, offering an unobstructed view of water that stretched to the horizon. Aidan unlocked the front door with the key Walter had given him years ago, during one of their Christmas visits. When Walter was feeling sentimental about family and legacy. Inside, the house smelled like salt air and old wood, comfortable and lived in rather than neglected. Walter's coffee mug sat in the kitchen sink, unwashed since his final morning. His reading glasses lay on the side table next to his chair. It's smaller than I remembered, Claire said, walking through the main room. But solid. Aidan tested a floorboard with his weight, examined the window frames for signs of rot or damage. Walter maintained everything properly. They spent an hour exploring the house room by room. Walter's bedroom with its nautical-themed decorations. The small guest room he'd used for storage. The kitchen with its 1980s appliances that still functioned perfectly. In Walter's desk drawer, Aidan found a manila folder labeled House Information. Inside were maintenance records, contractor receipts, warranty information, insurance policies, everything organized with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. He kept good records, Aidan observed. Just like you, Claire replied, watching him flip through the documentation with obvious appreciation for Walter's methodical approach. The property tax bill was current. The insurance was paid through the end of the year. The foundation was solid, the roof was recently replaced, and the electrical system had been updated to current codes. Margaret called again that evening. I was talking to some colleagues about your situation, she began without preamble. The consensus is that you're sitting on a significant financial opportunity, but the window won't stay open forever. Aidan listened while organizing the day's findings: Walter's records, his own notes about the property's condition, contact information for local contractors and service providers. The market is really hot right now, Margaret continued. Beachfront properties are selling within days of listing. You could probably get $400,000, maybe more if you price it aggressively. We're not looking to sell, Aidan said. Oh. Margaret's voice conveyed surprise, as if she'd assumed any reasonable person would immediately monetize such an inheritance. Well, that's interesting. I just assumed you'd want to take advantage of the opportunity. We're considering keeping it. Keeping it? As what? A vacation home. As our primary residence. The silence on Margaret's end lasted longer than usual. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from helpful to concerned. Aidan, dear, I don't think you understand what you're suggesting. Living at the beach isn't like visiting for weekends. The expenses, the isolation, the hurricane risks. It's not practical for people in your situation. What situation is that? Well, you're both working, you have responsibilities in the city. Claire's teaching position, your legal work. You can't just abandon your careers for some romantic notion about beach living. Claire watched Aidan's face as he processed Margaret's assumptions about their capabilities and judgment. His expression remained neutral, but she could see the subtle tension around his eyes that appeared when someone underestimated him. "We'll figure it out," Aidan said simply. "I'm just trying to be realistic. Sometimes emotional decisions aren't the wisest financial choices." After Margaret hung up, Aidan continued organizing Walter's records. Claire observed his methodical approach, the way he cross-referenced documents and made notes about inconsistencies or gaps in information. "She thinks we're being naive," Claire said. "She thinks I'm being naive," Aidan corrected. "She's never had much confidence in my decision-making abilities." "Since when?" "Since I married her daughter without asking permission first." They sat together on their apartment balcony, looking out toward the Gulf 3 miles away. City lights twinkled between them and the water, but on clear nights like this, they could almost imagine the sound of waves. "Are we being naive?" Claire asked. Aidan considered the question while reviewing the facts. Walter's house was structurally sound, financially manageable, and legally theirs without encumbrance. Their current apartment lease expired in 4 months. His legal work could be done remotely or through contract arrangements. Claire's teaching position was part-time and renewable anywhere. "I don't think so," he said. "But I think Margaret believes we are." "Does that matter?" "It might. People who think you're making mistakes sometimes try to help you correct them, whether you want help or not." The next morning brought another call from Margaret, this time with specific suggestions about real estate agents who specialized in coastal properties. "I've already talked to Linda Morrison, she's the top seller in the beach market," Margaret explained. "She's willing to do a preliminary assessment this week, just to give you a realistic idea of the property's value." "We didn't ask for an assessment," Aidan pointed out. "I know, but knowledge is power, isn't it? Even if you decide to keep the house, you should understand what you're choosing to hold onto instead of liquidating." Margaret's logic was sound, which made it more difficult to refuse without seeming unreasonable. Aidan agreed to meet with Linda Morrison, mostly to end the conversation before Margaret could suggest additional help they didn't want. Linda Morrison arrived at the beach house Saturday morning driving a Mercedes and carrying a tablet loaded with comparable sales data. She was professional, efficient, and obviously successful at converting reluctant sellers into motivated clients. "Beautiful property," she said, photographing the Gulf view from Walter's front porch. "The location alone is worth a premium, and the bones of the house are solid." She spent 45 minutes measuring rooms, assessing upgrades, and calculating potential market value based on recent sales of similar properties. "Conservative estimate, you're looking at $420 to $450, she concluded. "If you're willing to make some cosmetic improvements, new paint, updated fixtures, maybe refinish the hardwood floors, you could push it closer to $500. Aidan thanked her politely and said they'd consider her recommendations. "Don't wait too long," Linda advised. "Summer is prime selling season for beach properties, but inventory is starting to increase. The longer you wait, the more competition you'll face." After she left, Aidan and Claire sat on Walter's porch, watching pelicans dive for fish beyond the breakers. "Margaret was right about the value," Claire observed. "She usually is about financial matters," Aidan agreed. "That doesn't mean selling is the right decision." "But $400,000 is a lot of money," Aidan finished. "But it's not the only consideration." That evening, Margaret called with what she described as practical questions about their timeline for making decisions. "Linda Morrison said you seemed interested but non-committal," she began. "I understand wanting to take time with big decisions, but the market won't wait for you to feel ready." Aidan listened while Claire prepared dinner in their apartment kitchen. Through the window, the lights of downtown Tampa glittered like stars, familiar and comfortable but somehow less appealing than they'd seemed a week ago. "We're not interested in selling right now," he said. "Right now? Or not at all?" "We haven't decided." Margaret's sigh was audible through the phone. "Aidan, I don't mean to be critical, but sometimes I wonder if you fully appreciate the responsibilities that come with property ownership. It's not just about paying the mortgage, there are taxes, insurance, maintenance, emergency repairs." "I understand the responsibilities. Do you? Because 15 years in corporate law doesn't necessarily prepare someone for the realities of coastal property management." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret had never directly criticized Aidan's professional competence before. But her implication was clear: his legal background was irrelevant to the practical decisions they faced. "We'll manage," Aidan said quietly. "I hope so. For both your sakes." After she hung up, Claire found Aidan standing at their apartment window, looking out toward the Gulf. "She thinks we're making a mistake," Claire said. "She thinks I'm not qualified to make this decision," Aidan replied. "There's a difference. Are you angry?" Aidan considered the question. Margaret's doubt wasn't entirely unreasonable. He had no experience managing coastal property, and the financial stakes were significant. But her assumption that inexperience equaled incompetence bothered him more than he wanted to admit. "I'm motivated," he said finally. "To prove her wrong? To prove myself right." The next week, Aidan took a day off work to research everything Margaret had warned them about. Insurance requirements for coastal properties, hurricane preparation procedures, maintenance schedules for salt air environments, property tax implications for primary versus secondary residences. By Thursday, he had assembled a comprehensive file of information that addressed every concern Margaret had raised. The challenges were real but manageable. The costs were significant but within their budget. The risks were substantial but not prohibitive for people willing to prepare properly. Friday evening, Margaret called with news that Linda Morrison had received multiple inquiries about beachfront properties in their area. "The market is definitely heating up," she reported. "Linda thinks if you list soon, you could probably get asking price within a week." "We've decided to keep the house," Aidan said. The silence that followed suggested Margaret had been expecting a different answer. "Keep it? As in live there?" "As in live there. Aidan, I really think you should reconsider. I know the romance of beach living seems appealing, but the practical realities." "We've researched the practical realities," Aidan interrupted gently. "We're confident we can handle them. But what about your careers? Claire's teaching position, your work at Bay Financial?" "I'm transitioning to contract work. Claire can find teaching positions in Pinellas County." Margaret's voice, when it returned, carried a tone Aidan had never heard before: not just concern, but something closer to alarm. "This seems very sudden," she said. "Very impulsive for people who are usually so careful about major decisions." "We've been planning it for 2 weeks. 2 weeks isn't enough time to make this kind of life change. What if you hate living there? What if the expenses are more than you anticipated? What if there's a major hurricane? Then we'll deal with those problems if they arise. But why create problems unnecessarily? You have a good life here, stable income, established routines. Why throw that away for something so uncertain?" Aidan understood that Margaret's questions came from genuine concern mixed with fundamental disagreement about their judgment. She couldn't understand why anyone would choose uncertainty over security, risk over safety, possibility over predictability. "Because uncertain doesn't necessarily mean wrong," he said. After the call ended, Claire found Aidan on their balcony, looking out toward the lights that marked the coastline in the distance. "She's scared," Claire observed. "Of what?" "Of us making decisions she wouldn't make. Of us being happy in ways she doesn't understand." Aidan nodded slowly. Margaret's opposition wasn't really about property values or hurricane risks. It was about control, her need to guide decisions she believed were beyond their competence. And their apparent indifference to guidance she considered essential. "She'll come around," Claire said. "Maybe," Aidan agreed. "Or maybe she'll try harder to change our minds." The waves continued their endless rhythm 3 miles away, calling them toward something Margaret couldn't hear and didn't trust them to pursue alone. But Walter had trusted them. The deed in Aidan's briefcase proved that. Sometimes trust from the right person mattered more than doubt from everyone else. Moving day arrived on a bright Tuesday morning in March. The professional movers handled their furniture with practiced efficiency, while Aidan supervised and Claire directed traffic between their Tampa apartment and Walter's beach house. By afternoon, they were officially residents of Gulfside Drive, surrounded by boxes and the sound of waves that would become their new daily soundtrack. Margaret arrived unannounced Wednesday evening. Claire was unpacking kitchen items when she heard the car in the driveway. Through the window, she watched her mother emerge from her silver Lexus carrying a casserole dish and wearing an expression of determined helpfulness. "She brought food," Claire announced to Aidan, who was assembling a bookshelf in Walter's former den. "Peace offering?" he asked. Reconnaissance mission, Claire replied. Margaret knocked once and entered without waiting for an answer, a habit that had always annoyed Claire but seemed more intrusive in their new space. Surprise, Margaret called out, though her smile seemed forced. I brought dinner. Figured you'd be too busy to cook. She handed Claire the casserole and began touring the house with the critical eye of someone conducting an inspection rather than a friendly visit. It's smaller than I remembered, she observed, running her finger along a windowsill and examining it for dust. And the furniture arrangement. Well, I suppose you'll figure out what works. Aidan emerged from the den, wiping sawdust from his hands. Margaret, this is unexpected. I was in the neighborhood, she said, though they both knew their new address was 20 minutes from any place Margaret had legitimate business. Thought I'd see how you're settling in. She continued her tour, making observations that sounded like compliments but felt like criticisms. The view really is lovely. Shame about the water stains on that back wall, probably from the last hurricane. And this flooring. She tapped the hardwood with her heel. Might need refinishing sooner than you think. Aidan followed her assessments with interest. He'd examined every inch of the house during their decision-making process and found none of the problems Margaret was identifying. Which water stains? He asked. Margaret gestured vaguely toward the wall facing the gulf. Right there. You can see the discoloration if you look closely. Aidan looked closely. The wall showed normal aging but no evidence of water damage. I don't see any stains, he said. Well, they're subtle. You have to know what to look for. They sat down to dinner at Walter's kitchen table, the casserole dish between them like a peace offering with hidden terms and conditions. So, Margaret began, cutting into her tuna noodle casserole. What's your plan for hurricane season? Standard preparation, Aidan replied. Storm shutters, emergency supplies, evacuation route if necessary. Evacuation route to where? Inland hotels. Or back to Tampa if we still have friends willing to put us up. Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. You don't have backup arrangements already? What if everywhere inland is booked? What if the roads are closed? Then we'll figure it out when it happens. That's not really a plan, is it? More like hoping for the best. Claire watched the familiar pattern develop, Margaret identifying potential problems, escalating their significance, questioning their preparedness. But now the stakes felt higher because they were living with the consequences of decisions Margaret had opposed. We'll be fine, Claire said. I'm sure you will. It's just that hurricanes don't care about good intentions. They require actual preparation, not optimistic thinking. After Margaret left, Aidan and Claire finished unpacking their bedroom while discussing their mother's visit. She's looking for problems, Claire observed. She's creating problems, Aidan corrected. That wall doesn't have water damage, and she knows it. Why would she do that? Aidan folded his shirts with the same methodical precision he applied to legal documents. Because if we're making a mistake, she wants to be right about it. And if we're not making a mistake, she wants to create enough doubt to make us reconsider. Thursday brought Margaret's first phone call as official beach house critics. I've been thinking about your hurricane situation, she began. Have you researched flood insurance requirements? Because standard homeowners policies don't cover storm surge, and you're definitely in a flood zone. Aidan put the call on speaker while he organized Walter's financial records. We have flood insurance. Through whom? Because not all flood insurance is the same. You need to make sure you have adequate coverage for replacement cost, not just actual cash value. It's replacement cost coverage. Are you sure? Because a lot of people think they're adequately insured until they try to file a claim. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Margaret raising increasingly technical questions about their insurance coverage. None of which she would have asked if she genuinely believed they were competent to handle their own affairs. Friday brought a visit from Mrs. Chen, their elderly neighbor from across the street. She arrived carrying a plate of cookies and a welcome to the neighborhood smile. I knew Walter for 15 years, she told them over coffee on the front porch. Lovely man. Very organized, very careful about maintaining his property. Mrs. Chen was 86, sharp-minded, and apparently well-informed about neighborhood activities. That woman who was here yesterday, she said casually. Your mother? My mother-in-law, Claire replied. Ah, she spent a lot of time looking at the outside of your house. Measuring things, taking pictures with her phone. Aidan and Claire exchanged glances. Margaret hadn't mentioned any external inspection during her visit. Did she say why? Aidan asked. Said she was documenting maintenance needs for insurance purposes. Seemed very thorough. After Mrs. Chen left, Aidan walked the perimeter of the house, looking for whatever Margaret had been measuring and photographing. He found no obvious maintenance issues that would require documentation. Saturday brought Margaret's return, this time with a manila folder full of papers. I've been researching your insurance situation, she announced, settling into Walter's reading chair as if she'd been invited for a business meeting. And I'm afraid there are some gaps in your coverage that need immediate attention. She opened the folder and spread documents across the coffee table: insurance forms, coverage comparisons, claim procedures for coastal properties. Your current policy doesn't include wind damage protection, she explained. And your flood coverage has a deductible that could bankrupt you if you actually need to use it. Aidan examined the papers she'd brought. They appeared professional and comprehensive, but several details were incorrect. His policy number was wrong, the coverage amounts didn't match his actual insurance, and the company listed as his provider wasn't the one he'd contracted with. Where did you get this information? He asked. Through my real estate contacts. They deal with coastal properties all the time, so they know which insurance companies actually pay claims and which ones look for excuses to deny coverage. And they recommended specific changes to our policy? They recommended you switch to a company that specializes in high-risk coastal properties. It's more expensive, but the coverage is much more comprehensive. Margaret pulled out another set of documents: applications for new insurance with a company Aidan had never heard of. I took the liberty of getting quotes. You'd need to apply soon to get coverage before hurricane season, but they're willing to expedite the process if you submit applications this week. Aidan studied the applications more carefully. The coverage looked legitimate, but the premiums were nearly double what they were currently paying. And the deductibles were significantly higher despite Margaret's claims about better protection. We're satisfied with our current insurance, he said. Margaret's helpful expression shifted towards something less patient. Aidan, I don't think you understand how vulnerable you are with inadequate coverage. One major storm, and you could lose everything Walter left you. Our coverage is adequate. According to whom? According to our insurance agent and the independent adjuster who inspected the property before we purchased the policy. Margaret gathered her papers with obvious frustration. I'm just trying to help you avoid problems that could have been prevented with proper planning. We appreciate the concern, Claire said. But we're comfortable with the decisions we've made. After Margaret left, Aidan called their insurance agent to verify their coverage details. Everything was exactly as he'd understood it: comprehensive protection at reasonable premiums through a company with an excellent claims record. Why would someone suggest we need different insurance? He asked. Could be several reasons, the agent replied. Some companies pay referral fees for new customers. Some agents push high premium policies because they generate bigger commissions. Or someone might genuinely believe more coverage is always better, even when it's not necessary. Sunday evening brought Margaret's most direct approach yet. She arrived carrying real estate listings and a laptop computer, settling into Walter's living room as if preparing for a formal presentation. I've been thinking about your situation, she began, opening her laptop to display property search results. And I wonder if you've considered that keeping this house might not be the wisest long-term strategy. She turned the screen toward them, showing recent sales of comparable beachfront properties. The market has continued to appreciate since you inherited the house. You're probably looking at $460, maybe $480 if you list soon. The properties she'd found were impressive renovated beach houses with modern amenities and premium finishes that sold quickly at prices significantly higher than Walter's house could command in its current condition. These are all extensively renovated, Aidan pointed out. Exactly. Which brings me to my main concern. Margaret clicked to another screen showing estimated renovation costs for bringing older beach houses up to current market standards. To get top dollar for this property, you'd need to invest probably $100,000 in improvements. New kitchen, updated bathrooms, refinished floors, fresh paint throughout. And that's assuming no structural issues. She paused to let the numbers sink in. Or you could sell as is for $420 to $440 and avoid the time, expense, and risk of a major renovation project. Claire studied the renovation estimates Margaret had compiled. The projects she'd identified would certainly improve the house's value, but they weren't necessary for the property to be comfortable and functional. We're not looking to maximize resale value, Claire said. We're planning to live here. For how long? Margaret asked. 5 years? 10? Because markets change, and you might not get another opportunity like this. Aidan closed Margaret's laptop with gentle finality. We're not interested in selling. Margaret's carefully constructed presentation seemed to deflate. Her helpful demeanor shifted towards something more pointed. I don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this, she said. I'm offering practical advice based on real market knowledge, and you're dismissing it without serious consideration. We've given it serious consideration, Aidan replied. We've decided the house meets our needs as it is. Your needs today, maybe. But what about 5 years from now? What about when you're older and the maintenance becomes overwhelming? What about when the next hurricane hits and insurance doesn't cover everything? Her questions carried an edge of frustration that hadn't been present in earlier conversations. Margaret seemed genuinely puzzled by their indifference to opportunities she considered obvious. We'll deal with those problems if and when they arise, Aidan said. That's not planning, that's wishful thinking. After Margaret left, Aidan and Claire sat on Walter's porch watching the sun set over water that belonged, in some meaningful sense, to them now. She's not wrong about the market, Claire observed. She's not wrong about the numbers, Aidan agreed. But she's wrong about what matters to us. What if she's right about the maintenance costs? The hurricane risks? Aidan considered the question while watching pelicans dive for fish beyond the breakers. Margaret's concerns were legitimate, but her solutions all involved abandoning their plans rather than adapting to challenges. Then we'll learn to handle them, he said. Like Walter did for 30 years. Margaret doesn't think we can. Margaret thinks we shouldn't have to. The distinction mattered. Margaret wasn't questioning their capability so much as their judgment in choosing difficulty over simplicity. Risk over safety, responsibility over freedom from obligation. But some things were worth the complexity they required. Some dreams demanded more than safety. Walter had understood that. His bequest proved it. Silence becomes a choice, Aidan thought. And sometimes choosing silence reveals more about someone's intentions than their words ever could. Margaret's helpful visits were becoming more frequent, her concerns more urgent, her solutions more insistent. The pattern suggested someone who couldn't accept that her advice was unwelcome. Her expertise unneeded, her judgment challenged by people she considered less qualified to make important decisions. Tomorrow would bring new phone calls, new concerns, new reasons why their choices were problematic. But tonight, the waves continued their ancient rhythm, washing away the day's tensions and reminding them why Walter had loved this place enough to preserve it for people who would appreciate what he'd protected. 3 weeks into their new life at the beach house, Aidan and Claire had established comfortable routines. Morning coffee on the porch overlooking the Gulf. Afternoon walks along the shoreline. Evening meals prepared in Walter's kitchen with windows open to catch the salt breeze. Saturday morning arrived with unusual quiet, no phone calls from Margaret. No unexpected visits, no helpful suggestions about insurance or maintenance or market opportunities. At 10:30, that quiet ended. Margaret's silver Lexus pulled into their driveway, followed immediately by a gray Honda with faded paint and a cracked windshield. Aidan watched from Walter's reading chair as Margaret emerged wearing her most professional outfit: navy blazer, pressed slacks, jewelry that caught the morning sunlight. The man who climbed out of the Honda wore a rumpled suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived several decades of hard use. His thin hair was combed carefully over a balding scalp, and his glasses sat slightly crooked on his face. Margaret knocked once on the front door, then used the spare key they'd given her for emergencies. "Hello," she called, stepping inside with the confidence of someone conducting expected business. "Aidan? Claire? We're here," Aidan replied, closing the book he'd been reading. Margaret entered the living room with purposeful strides, gesturing for her companion to follow. She settled into Walter's chair as if claiming territory, while the man remained standing near the doorway, clutching his briefcase nervously. "This is Todd Brennan," Margaret announced. "Our family attorney. I thought it was time we made this arrangement more official." Todd attempted what was probably meant to be a professional smile, but perspiration was already visible on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Claire emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. She nodded politely but remained standing, her posture alert in the way it became when unexpected situations required careful navigation. Todd specializes in family property law, Margaret continued, her tone suggesting this meeting had been planned for weeks. He's handled dozens of situations like ours. What situation is that? Aidan asked. Margaret's smile brightened with the enthusiasm of someone delivering good news. The optimization situation, making sure Walter's gift achieves its full potential for everyone involved. Todd fumbled with his briefcase, eventually producing a manila folder thick with official-looking documents. The papers were properly formatted, weighted with legal terminology that sounded important and complex. This is really just a formality, Margaret explained, sliding the folder across Walter's coffee table toward Aidan. A family trust structure that protects the property while maximizing its benefit for all family members. Aidan opened the folder and began reading with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered more than explanations. The concept is straightforward, Margaret continued. Instead of individual ownership, we establish a trust that can make strategic decisions about the property's use and management. Todd nodded enthusiastically, apparently relieved that Margaret was handling the complex explanations. Very standard approach. We see this frequently with inherited properties. Aidan's eyes moved methodically through the first page, then the second. His expression remained neutral, but Claire caught the subtle change in his posture that indicated focused professional attention. Who serves as the trustee? Aidan asked without looking up from the documents. Someone with relevant experience, naturally, Margaret replied. Property management requires expertise that not everyone possesses. And that would be? I have the real estate background to handle the administrative responsibilities. Aidan continued reading. This gives the trustee authority to sell the property. Margaret's response came quickly, as if she'd anticipated the question. Only when beneficial for the trust beneficiaries. For tax optimization, market timing, protection against potential liability. Who are the beneficiaries? All family members, equally protected under the trust structure. Todd was perspiring more obviously now, his confident demeanor beginning to crack under the weight of questions he apparently hadn't expected. Aidan set the papers down and looked directly at Todd. How long have you been practicing law, Mr. Brennan? 6 years, Todd replied. Mostly real estate transactions, some estate planning work. Where did you attend law school? Todd's eyes flicked toward Margaret before returning to Aidan. Stetson University. Graduated 2018. And Mrs. Foster retained your services when? Earlier this week. She explained the family situation, said you needed assistance with property optimization strategies. What family situation specifically? Todd's briefcase slipped slightly in his sweating hands. The inheritance complications, tax implications, liability exposure, management challenges for inexperienced property owners. Aidan nodded slowly, recognizing the same fabricated concerns Margaret had been promoting for weeks. Todd was repeating her invented problems as if they were established legal realities. I see, Aidan said quietly. He reached for his own briefcase, a worn leather case he'd carried through 15 years of corporate legal work. From it, he extracted a neat stack of documents. Mr. Brennan, Aidan said conversationally, before we proceed with your trust proposal, perhaps you should examine some relevant information. The first document was a printout from their security system. Margaret's image was crystal clear as she used her emergency key to enter their house on multiple occasions when they weren't home. Todd leaned forward, squinting at the timestamp and image quality. What exactly am I looking at? Security footage documenting unauthorized entry to this property, Aidan replied calmly. Multiple instances over the past 3 weeks. The second paper showed a detailed log of Margaret's activities during those unauthorized visits, photographing room dimensions, examining financial documents left on Walter's desk, removing small items and returning them to different locations. The third document was a screenshot of Margaret's real estate license information, with highlighted sections about professional ethics violations related to unauthorized property access by licensed agents. Margaret's confident expression began to falter as she recognized the evidence accumulating on Walter's coffee table. Her breath caught when she understood that her helpful visits had been comprehensively documented. These activities were recorded, Aiden continued, his voice maintaining the same calm, professional tone he'd used in countless corporate legal meetings. Unauthorized entry, removal and replacement of personal property, documentation of private information without consent. Todd's face had gone pale. His hands trembled as he tried to process the legal implications of what he was seeing. Furthermore, Aiden said, adding another document to the collection, the trust agreement you've prepared contains several significant legal flaws. He pointed to specific sections of Todd's paperwork. The property description includes an incorrect lot number. The witness requirements don't meet current Florida standards. And this notarization stamp. He showed Todd the signature page. This was notarized yesterday, but dated 2 weeks ago. Margaret stared at the evidence spread across Walter's coffee table. Her carefully planned presentation was disintegrating as each document revealed the gap between her stated intentions and her actual behavior. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aiden looked directly at her, his expression calm but unmistakably serious. "Someone with 15 years of experience in corporate law, including contract analysis, real estate transactions, and fraud prevention." The room fell completely silent except for the distant sound of waves and the soft hum of air conditioning. Todd was the first to move. He stuffed papers hastily into his briefcase, his professional composure completely abandoned. "I need to leave," he muttered. "This isn't what I was told. I wasn't informed about." He fled toward the door, abandoning Margaret to face the consequences of assumptions she should never have made. Margaret sat frozen in Walter's chair, her navy blazer suddenly looking more like a costume than professional attire. "You can't prove intent to defraud," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. Aiden methodically gathered his evidence, organizing it with the same precision he applied to all legal documentation. "I don't need to prove intent to you, Margaret. I only need to establish a pattern of behavior for the appropriate authorities. You wouldn't involve outside parties over a family misunderstanding. I would if the family misunderstanding involved criminal trespassing and attempted property fraud." Margaret stood abruptly, her confidence shattered but her determination still intact. "This isn't over, Aiden. You're making a mistake by rejecting legitimate help." "The only mistake here was yours," Aiden replied quietly. "You assumed that quiet meant stupid, that courtesy meant weakness, that family relationship meant unlimited access." Margaret walked to the door, her heels clicking sharply against Walter's hardwood floors. She paused at the threshold, turning back one final time. Walter would have wanted his family to work together, not against each other. Walter did want his family to work together, Aiden agreed. That's exactly why he left his house to people he trusted to protect it. After Margaret left, the beach house felt different, somehow lighter, as if a weight they hadn't fully recognized had been lifted from the rooms. Claire moved to Walter's chair and smoothed the cushion where Margaret had sat, reclaiming the space for their own use. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Known what specifically?" "That she was planning something like this." Aiden joined her by the window, watching Margaret's car disappear down Gulfside Drive, probably for the last time. "Since the insurance papers," he said. "The documents were too detailed to be casual research, and too inaccurate to be legitimate. Someone was building a case for why we were incompetent to manage our own affairs." "And Todd?" "Hired from a legal referral service. Real attorney, but inexperienced enough to accept Margaret's version of events without independent verification. She probably told him we were family members who needed guidance with a complex inheritance." Claire processed the realization that her mother had spent weeks planning an elaborate deception designed to gain control of property that didn't belong to her. "What happens now?" "Now we change the door locks," Aiden said. "And we document everything that happened here today. Will you report her to the authorities?" Aiden considered the question while organizing the evidence he'd presented. Margaret's behavior had clearly crossed legal boundaries, but family prosecution carried complications beyond simple justice. "Not unless she tries something like this again," he said. "But we'll keep the documentation in case it becomes necessary." Outside, the Gulf of Mexico stretched toward the horizon. Waves carrying away the morning's confrontation with the same indifferent rhythm that had shaped coastlines for millennia. Walter's house stood solid around them, no longer threatened by schemes or false claims. The inheritance had been tested and proven, emerging stronger from the challenge. The room tilts, and certainty breaks, Aidan thought. But when certainty breaks in the right direction, truth emerges from the wreckage. Margaret had gambled that a quiet man would be an easy target. That professional courtesy indicated professional incompetence, that family relationships provided immunity from consequences. She'd gambled wrong on all counts. The truth was simpler than her elaborate schemes. Walter had chosen his beneficiaries carefully, and some gifts came with their own protection built in. Margaret's heels struck the wooden porch with sharp, deliberate sounds as she descended to her car. Each step echoed across the water like accusations she couldn't voice, frustration she couldn't express without admitting what she'd attempted to accomplish. She drove away from Gulfside Drive faster than usual, gravel spraying behind her tires in sandy clouds that settled slowly in her wake. By evening, the phone calls began. Claire answered the first one while Aidan was installing new deadbolts on both the front and back doors. Margaret's sister Linda from Jacksonville, her voice carrying immediate concern mixed with barely controlled anger. "What happened today?" Linda demanded. "Margaret called me in tears. She says Aidan humiliated her in front of a lawyer and accused her of criminal behavior." Claire held the phone away from her ear so Aidan could hear the conversation while he worked with his screwdriver. "She tried to steal our house, Linda," Claire replied calmly. "That's not how she tells it. According to Margaret, she was trying to help you establish proper legal protection for an inheritance. You're not equipped to manage," and Aidan responded with paranoid accusations. "She had been entering our home without permission and documenting our private information. She had a key. You gave her a key for emergencies. Emergency access doesn't include unauthorized visits to photograph our belongings and research ways to take legal control of our property." The line went quiet for a long moment. When Linda's voice returned, it carried less certainty than before. "Margaret wouldn't do that," she said, but the conviction was gone. "The security cameras say otherwise." Linda hung up without another word. The second call came from Margaret's daughter Susan in Orlando. The third from her son David in Miami. The fourth from relatives Claire barely knew, people Margaret had obviously contacted with carefully edited versions of the day's events. Each conversation followed the same pattern: initial outrage based on Margaret's account, detailed explanation of what actually happened. Uncomfortable silence as the caller processed information that didn't match Margaret's narrative. Reluctant acknowledgement that perhaps the situation was more complex than they'd been told. Margaret had been working the phones systematically, crafting a version of events that portrayed her as the victim of ungrateful relatives and legal persecution. But her story contained too many inconsistencies, required too many assumptions about Aidan's paranoia and Claire's disloyalty. By Sunday evening, the family calls had stopped. Monday morning brought consequences Margaret hadn't anticipated. At 9:15 a.m., Janet Williams from Human Resources at Coastal Realty Group called Margaret into her office. Margaret gathered her files, straightened her blazer, and walked the familiar hallway with the confidence of someone who'd never faced professional scrutiny. Janet sat behind a metal desk with a manila folder open in front of her, her expression professionally neutral but obviously concerned. "Margaret, I've received some disturbing information about your recent activities involving family property disputes." Margaret's stomach dropped, but she maintained her composure. "I'm not sure what you mean." Janet opened the folder, revealing copies of the security footage. Time-stamped images showing Margaret using her key to enter Aidan and Claire's house during hours when she knew they were away. "Did you access private property without the owner's explicit consent for each visit?" Janet asked. "It's family property." There was confusion about the extent of my access permissions. "Did you remove, photograph, or document private information belonging to the property owners?" Margaret stared at the evidence Aidan had somehow provided to her employer, creating a professional crisis from what she'd assumed would remain a private family matter. "There were misunderstandings about the scope of assistance I was providing," she said. Janet closed the folder with finality. "Margaret, Coastal Realty cannot be associated with potential violations of client privacy and property access ethics. Real estate professionals are held to strict standards regarding unauthorized entry and documentation of private property. She slid a resignation form across the desk. "We'll need this completed by end of business today." Margaret sat in her car in the office parking lot for 45 minutes after cleaning out her desk. 15 years of employment reduced to a cardboard box of personal items and a resignation letter that would effectively end her career in Florida real estate. Her phone buzzed constantly, text messages from colleagues who'd heard rumors, clients asking about scheduled appointments, friends expressing confusion about what they'd been told. Margaret drove home to an apartment that suddenly felt smaller, shabbier, more temporary than it had that morning. Tuesday brought worse news. The envelope from the county attorney's office was thick, official, intimidating. Inside, a cease and desist order that prohibited her from accessing, claiming interest in, or attempting to influence legal decisions regarding property located at 1247 Gulfside Drive. Violation would result in criminal trespassing charges and potential prosecution for harassment. Margaret read the document 3 times, each reading making the legal language more devastating. Aiden hadn't just embarrassed her in front of Todd Brennan. He'd created a permanent legal record that would follow her if she attempted anything similar in the future. Wednesday's mail brought an envelope that made Margaret's hands shake before she even opened it. A foreclosure notice. For a moment, panic overwhelmed rational thought. Then she realized the address was wrong. The notice belonged to Mrs. Patterson in 4B, misdelivered by a careless postal worker. But seeing the word, foreclosure, in bold letters across official letterhead sent ice through Margaret's veins anyway. She thought about her own mortgage payments, her car loan, the credit cards she'd been carrying since her divorce. Without her real estate income, without commissions from pending sales, how long could she maintain her current lifestyle? The beach house would have solved everything. Conservative estimates put its value at $400,000, possibly more with strategic improvements. Even a partial family settlement would have cleared her debts and provided the financial security she desperately needed. Now that possibility had vanished, taking her professional reputation with it. Thursday evening, Margaret stood in her kitchen staring at a microwave dinner she couldn't afford to heat because the gas had been shut off for non-payment. Her reflection in the microwave door showed a woman she barely recognized. Hair unwashed for 3 days, makeup smeared from crying, professional blazer discarded in favor of an old sweater with holes at the elbows. How had everything collapsed so quickly? She'd worked so hard, sacrificed so much. The divorce had taken half her assets and most of her social connections. The real estate market had grown increasingly competitive, with younger agents using social media and virtual technology to steal clients she'd served for years. Walter's house had seemed like justice finally arriving, a gift from the universe to someone who'd always taken care of family responsibilities, who'd always been available when relatives needed guidance or assistance. But Walter had chosen differently. He'd given his most valuable asset to Aiden and Claire, people who already had stability, already owned property, already possessed the professional credentials to manage complex financial decisions. People who didn't need the money the way she did. It wasn't fair. Margaret's phone rang, but she'd been ignoring calls all week. Her voicemail was full of messages she couldn't face: collection agencies, concerned friends, former clients asking for explanations she couldn't provide. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Margaret Foster? This is regarding your real estate license. A complaint has been filed with the state licensing board. Margaret hung up without listening to the rest. She sat on her couch in the growing darkness, holding her silent phone. Surrounded by the ordinary sounds of evening life: air conditioners cycling, televisions murmuring through thin walls, cars arriving as people returned home from jobs she no longer had. Normal life continuing around her while her own world disintegrated. She thought about calling Aiden and Claire, apologizing for the misunderstandings, explaining her financial desperation, begging for forgiveness and perhaps some small consideration that might salvage something from the wreckage of her choices. But pride prevented the call. Pride and the growing realization that her humiliation at the beach house had been deliberate, calculated, designed to destroy not just her plans but her entire professional life. Aiden had known exactly what he was doing. He'd allowed her to reveal her intentions completely, then systematically dismantled Not just her scheme but her career, her family relationships, and her reputation in the community. He'd played her like an amateur trying to compete with a professional. "This isn't over," she'd said at the beach house. But sitting alone in her darkening apartment, surrounded by evidence of her professional and financial collapse, Margaret finally understood that it was completely over. She'd lost her job, her reputation, her income, and her family relationships. She'd exposed herself as desperate enough to steal from relatives, manipulative enough to hire lawyers for fraudulent purposes, and careless enough to leave evidence of crimes that could have resulted in criminal charges. Recovery from this level of public failure might be impossible in Tampa, where real estate was a small community and reputation was everything. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the silence of her empty apartment, the absence of the life she'd been trying so hard to preserve. When control slips, desperation speaks louder, she realized. And desperation had been speaking for her far longer than she'd admitted to herself. Tomorrow, she would need to find a different life in a different place. Tonight, she would mourn the future she'd almost achieved, the security she'd almost stolen, the justice she'd convinced herself she deserved. Outside her window, Tampa continued its evening routines, families sharing dinner, couples walking dogs. People living the ordinary lives that had somehow become beyond her reach. The beach house stood 15 miles away, solid and secure, protected now by better locks and legal documents that would follow anyone who threatened it again. Margaret would never see it again. She no longer had the luxury of schemes or the safety net of professional credentials. She had only the consequences of choices that had seemed reasonable when she'd made them, inevitable when she'd convinced herself they were necessary. Now they were simply finished. And so was she. That evening, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay beside Aidan, listening to his steady breathing, but her mind kept returning to Margaret's face during the confrontation. The shock, then calculation, then something harder, a desperation mixed with entitlement that felt familiar in ways Claire couldn't immediately name. At 2 a.m., she rose quietly and walked to the kitchen. Through the window, moonlight painted silver patterns on the water, creating a bridge of light that stretched toward the horizon. She made chamomile tea and settled at Walter's table, the place where they'd first read his will and learned about the gift that had changed everything. Memory pulled her backward through 25 years of marriage, searching for the thread that connected Margaret's recent behavior to patterns that had always existed but never been properly named. The thread began with Claire's first checking account. She'd been 28, recently married, transitioning from her mother's financial oversight to independent money management. The responsibility had felt overwhelming: bills, budgets, savings plans, investment decisions that could affect their future. Margaret had offered help. Banks make mistakes constantly, she'd explained, reviewing Claire's monthly statements with the authority of someone who understood complex financial systems. You need someone watching for errors, unauthorized charges, opportunities for better interest rates. For 18 months, Margaret had managed Claire's teacher's salary with impressive efficiency. Direct deposits, automatic bill payments, investment transfers, all coordinated through Margaret's better understanding of how money should work. Claire discovered the discrepancies by accident while preparing tax documents. $20 from the checking account. $50 from savings. Small amounts that appeared as legitimate transfers but didn't correspond to any transactions Claire had authorized. Over 18 months, nearly $800 had disappeared from accounts Margaret controlled. When confronted, Margaret had wept, apologized profusely, explained about temporary financial pressures from her own divorce proceedings, promises to repay everything once her settlement was finalized. "I was going to tell you before tax season," she'd sobbed. "I just needed time to make it right without worrying you unnecessarily." Claire had forgiven her. Family forgave family, especially family members struggling through difficult circumstances. But she'd quietly taken back control of her financial accounts. The pattern had continued through the years, subtle and persistent as erosion. Margaret offering help that somehow required Margaret's control. Inserting herself into family financial decisions with reasonable explanations that created unreasonable obligations. Claire's wedding guest list had grown by 30 people she'd never met, business contacts and family friends who'd be hurt if they weren't included. The increased costs were never acknowledged, much less shared. Their choice of honeymoon destination had been improved by Margaret's research into better value options that coincidentally earned her travel agent points she could use for her own vacations. Aidan's decision to join a small law firm instead of accepting a corporate position had been corrected through Margaret's networking connections, leading to the Bay Financial job that paid better but required longer hours and more travel. Always helpful, always knowledgeable, always taking slightly more control than she'd been given. The next morning, Claire drove to the Pinellas County Senior Center. She needed perspective from people who understood family complications without judgment, who'd navigated decades of relationships that grew more complex with age and changing circumstances. Mrs. Rodriguez, a 78-year-old former bank manager, listened to Claire's story over coffee and homemade cookies in the community room overlooking Tampa Bay. Family financial abuse is more common than people realize, she said matter-of-factly. Adult children, in-laws, relatives who see elderly family members or younger family members as opportunities rather than people. But Margaret isn't a stranger, Claire protested. She's my mother. That makes it more dangerous, not less, Mrs. Rodriguez replied gently. Family members know your weaknesses, your soft spots, your triggers. They know exactly which buttons to push to make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. She leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years helping people manage their financial lives and avoid predatory relationships. They always say it's for your own good. You can't handle this complexity. Let me manage the details. Don't worry about understanding everything. Trust me to make the right decisions. Claire thought about Margaret's recent phone calls. The constant emphasis on how overwhelming beach house ownership would be for people without real estate experience. What should we have done differently? Exactly what you did, Mrs. Rodriguez said. Document everything. Set clear boundaries. Don't feel guilty about protecting what belongs to you. People who exploit family trust are counting on you being too polite to fight back effectively. That afternoon, Aidan worked at Walter's kitchen table, organizing documents with the methodical precision that had made him successful in corporate law. Claire watched him sort financial records, legal correspondence, insurance policies into categories that made sense only to his systematic mind. Each folder was labeled with dates and contents, each piece of evidence filed according to some organizational system he'd probably learned in law school. Find anything interesting? She asked. Aidan held up a receipt Margaret had submitted to Todd Brennan as evidence of her financial contributions to the house's maintenance. This shows payment for roof repairs made 4 months ago, he said. Claire examined the document. The letterhead looked legitimate, the amount seemed reasonable. The date fell within the timeframe Margaret claimed to have been helping with Walter's property expenses. Is it real? The receipt is real. But the work was done on Margaret's apartment building, not Walter's house. She changed the address and copied Walter's name over the original customer information. Claire felt the familiar mixture of amazement and sadness that accompanied each new revelation about Margaret's behavior. The creativity was impressive in its audacity, troubling in its implications for how long Margaret had been planning elaborate deceptions. How many other documents did she alter? 4 so far. All small modifications, dates, addresses, amounts. Easy to miss unless you know what to look for and have access to the original records. Friday brought Margaret's final desperate attempt. She filed a formal complaint with the county, claiming Aidan and Claire had gained possession of Walter's house through undue influence over a mentally incompetent elderly man, whose judgment had been compromised by age and isolation. The complaint included testimony from neighbors who allegedly witnessed Walter's confusion in his final months. Medical records suggesting cognitive decline, questions about the timing of the will's most recent revision. She's arguing that Walter wasn't mentally capable of making sound decisions about his property, Aidan explained to Claire over dinner. Can she prove that? She can try, but proving mental incompetence requires evidence that doesn't exist. Aidan opened another file folder, revealing Walter's complete medical records, correspondence with his estate attorney, and photographs of Walter taken during his final weeks. The photos showed Walter working in his garden, organizing his workshop, reading complex financial documents with obvious comprehension. His physician had documented his mental clarity in detailed notes dated within days of his death. Walter's doctor has provided a written statement confirming his cognitive competence right up until the end, Aiden said. The estate attorney who prepared his will followed standard protocols for ensuring Walter understood every provision before signing. So Margaret's complaint won't succeed? Not unless she has evidence we haven't seen. And if she had that kind of evidence, she would have used it weeks ago instead of trying to manipulate us into signing trust documents. Saturday evening found Aiden on the beach house porch as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. That reminded him why Walter had loved this place enough to protect it for people who would appreciate what he'd preserved. Claire joined him on the weathered swing Walter had hung decades earlier, when he first bought the house as a young man with dreams of retirement by the water. "Thinking about patterns?" she asked. "Thinking about choices," Aiden replied. "Walter's choice to leave this house to us instead of including Margaret in his estate planning." Claire considered this. Walter had been mentally sharp until the end, observant about family dynamics, careful about legal and financial decisions. His choice of beneficiaries hadn't been random or sentimental. He knew, she said. Knew what specifically? About Margaret's need to control things that belonged to other people. Her pattern of turning help into ownership, assistance into authority. Aiden nodded slowly. He was protecting his final gift from someone who would see it as an opportunity to be managed rather than a responsibility to be honored. As darkness settled over the Gulf, they sat in comfortable silence. The waves continued their ancient rhythm, carrying away the day's tensions and bringing tomorrow's possibilities with the reliability of natural law. Memory sharpens resolve, Aiden thought. Sometimes the most important lessons came from recognizing patterns that had always been present. Waiting for someone brave enough to name them clearly and act on what the naming revealed. Walter had named them in his will, choosing his beneficiaries based on character rather than blood relationship. Now it was their turn to protect what he'd tried to preserve, not just from Margaret's schemes, but from anyone else who might mistake kindness for weakness, family obligation for unlimited access. The house stood solid around them, no longer threatened by false claims or manipulative schemes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they would listen to the water and remember that some battles were worth fighting, some gifts were worth protecting. And some love was strong enough to survive the disappointment of those who confused taking with receiving. 4 weeks later, Aiden adjusted his tie in the Pinellas County Courthouse bathroom mirror. The reflection showed a man who'd spent 15 years navigating corporate legal battles, but never one quite this personal. Claire waited in the hallway, holding their evidence folders with steady hands. Her navy dress was simple and professional, conveying competence without ostentation, the careful choice of someone who understood that courtrooms responded to substance over performance. "Ready?" Aiden asked. "As ready as we can be," Claire replied. The courtroom smelled of old wood and bureaucratic efficiency. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the slightly greenish tone that made everyone look vaguely unwell. Judge Patricia Hernandez presided from the bench, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her expression professionally neutral as she reviewed the morning's docket. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table with Harrison Webb, an attorney who specialized in contested estates and property disputes. Webb possessed the polished confidence that came from decades of successful litigation. His expensive suit and careful grooming projecting exactly the kind of authority that impressed judges and intimidated unprepared opponents. Webb's opening statement painted Margaret as a devoted family member, trying to protect an elderly relative from his own declining judgment and the manipulative influence of opportunistic beneficiaries. "Your Honor, my client observed troubling changes in Walter Foster's mental capacity during his final months." Webb began, his voice carrying practiced sympathy. Confusion, memory lapses, susceptibility to influence by individuals who gained his trust through isolation and manipulation. He gestured toward Aiden and Claire with the kind of restrained concern that suggested deep worry about vulnerable people making regrettable choices. "The evidence will show that the defendants systematically separated Mr. Foster from his extended family, gained undue influence over his decision-making processes, and manipulated him into altering his will to benefit themselves at the expense of relatives who had provided years of genuine care and financial support." Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her performance both restrained and compelling. She looked every inch the grieving family member forced to take legal action to protect an elderly relative's legacy. Webb presented his evidence methodically. Medical records documenting Walter's age-related health issues, arthritis, high blood pressure, prescription medications that could affect cognitive function. Testimony from neighbors about occasional confusion, moments when Walter seemed disoriented about time or place. Financial documents purporting to show Margaret's legitimate contributions to house maintenance and improvements. Your Honor, the defendants want this court to believe my client attempted to defraud them, Webb continued, his tone suggesting the absurdity of such accusations. But the evidence shows a woman who genuinely cared for her elderly relative, who invested her own resources in his property and well-being, and who deserves recognition of her legitimate claims to partial ownership. Judge Hernandez listened without expression, occasionally taking notes in the precise handwriting of someone who'd presided over thousands of similar disputes, and learned to distinguish between legitimate grievances and elaborate fabrications. When Webb finished, silence settled over the courtroom like dust after an explosion. Aidan rose slowly. He carried no prepared notes, no theatrical props, no carefully rehearsed presentation. 15 years of corporate legal experience had taught him that judges responded better to facts than performance, evidence than eloquence. Your Honor, he began quietly, I'm not here as a corporate attorney today. I'm here as Walter Foster's nephew, defending his final wishes against someone who refuses to accept them. He moved toward the evidence table with deliberate, calm movements that suggested complete confidence in what he was about to present. Mr. Webb wants this court to believe this case concerns mental competence and family devotion. It doesn't. This case concerns attempted theft disguised as concern, fraud presented as family assistance. Aidan lifted the first document from his carefully organized collection. Security footage showing the plaintiff entering Walter's house without permission on multiple occasions. Using copied keys, searching through private belongings, photographing personal financial information. He set the evidence before the judge, then selected the next piece of documentation. Bank records proving the plaintiff altered legitimate receipts to create false claims about her financial contributions to property she never owned or maintained. Another document joined the growing collection. County records showing the plaintiff attempted to file fraudulent paperwork claiming partial ownership of property that belonged entirely to Walter Foster. Judge Hernandez leaned forward slightly, her attention focused entirely on the evidence accumulating before her. And finally, Aidan said, producing the manila folder Margaret had brought to their house with Todd Brennan. Forged trust documents designed to transfer property ownership to the plaintiff through manufactured urgency and legal deception. He placed each piece of evidence with quiet precision, building a case that spoke through documentation rather than emotion. Your Honor, Walter Foster spent his final years making careful, deliberate decisions about his estate. He chose his beneficiaries based on trust, character, and genuine relationship rather than blood connection or persistent demands for inclusion. Webb objected. Your Honor, Mr. Mitchell is not representing himself as licensed counsel in this proceeding. I don't need formal representation, Aidan interrupted gently. I need justice for someone who can't defend his choices himself. Judge Hernandez studied the evidence for several minutes that felt much longer. The courtroom remained silent except for the soft whisper of air conditioning and the distant sounds of normal courthouse business continuing in other rooms. Ms. Foster, the judge said finally, do you have documentation supporting your claims of financial contribution to your uncle's property? Margaret's attorney whispered urgently in her ear. She shook her head slightly, reluctantly. Do you have receipts, canceled checks, or bank records showing legitimate expenses paid from your personal funds for property maintenance or improvements? Again, whispered consultation between Margaret and Webb. Again, Margaret's hesitant acknowledgement that such records didn't exist. Do you have any evidence beyond altered documents and fabricated receipts supporting your claim to ownership interest in Walter Foster's property? This time, Margaret answered directly, her voice barely audible. No, Your Honor. Judge Hernandez set down the papers and looked directly at Margaret with the expression of someone who'd seen too many similar cases to feel surprise. but not so many as to become indifferent to the human cost of family greed. Ms. Foster, this court has reviewed extensive evidence of attempted fraud. Security footage documenting multiple instances of unauthorized entry. Falsified maintenance records designed to create false claims of property investment. Forged legal documents intended to circumvent legitimate estate planning through deception and manufactured crises. Margaret's face went pale as the weight of official language settled over her like a net that was finally closing. Furthermore, your actions raise serious questions about potential criminal behavior. Breaking and entering, document forgery, attempted theft through fraudulent legal manipulation. This court could refer these matters to the state attorney for prosecution. Webb half rose from his chair. Your Honor, my client's actions were motivated by legitimate family concerns about an elderly relative's vulnerability. Your client's actions were motivated by greed and a complete disregard for legal boundaries, Judge Hernandez replied with sharp finality. This court will not validate attempted theft simply because it was perpetrated by a family member using emotional manipulation and fraudulent documentation. She raised her gavel once, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a period at the end of a long, complicated sentence. Case dismissed with prejudice. The defendant's ownership of the property is confirmed and protected. The plaintiff's claims are ruled baseless, fraudulent, and without any merit whatsoever. Margaret sat motionless, staring at the judge's bench as if the words hadn't quite penetrated her understanding. Her attorney gathered papers quickly, already calculating his professional distance from a case that had become embarrassing and potentially damaging to his reputation. Aidan felt Claire's hand slip into his. After 15 years of marriage, some victories were best shared in silence, processed together rather than celebrated publicly. Outside the courthouse, Florida's spring heat hit them like a wall. Margaret emerged minutes later, walking unsteadily toward the parking garage. Her navy suit now seemed more like a costume than courtroom attire. And her confident bearing had collapsed into something that looked like defeat mixed with disbelief. She didn't look back toward them or acknowledge their presence. Whatever relationship had existed between them before this moment had ended permanently in that courtroom. Is it really over? Claire asked as they reached their car. Aidan considered the question carefully. Legal victories sometimes created new problems, and people like Margaret didn't always accept judicial decisions gracefully. The legal part is over, he said. The rest, we'll have to see. That evening, they sat on Walter's porch watching sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of orange and gold. The waves rolled steadily toward shore, carrying away the day's tensions and bringing tomorrow's possibilities with the reliability of natural law. Claire opened a bottle of wine Walter had been saving in his kitchen cabinet for a special occasion. The label was faded, the vintage older than their marriage, but it tasted of time and patience and decisions made with careful thought about what mattered most. To Walter, she said, raising her glass toward the horizon where he'd loved to watch dolphins surface beyond the breakers. To Walter, Aidan agreed. And to the wisdom of choosing people based on character rather than convenience. The wine tasted like victory, but also like responsibility. They'd defended Walter's choice, but now they had to prove worthy of the trust he'd placed in them. Today, the paperwork protected us instead of erasing us, Aidan thought. Sometimes justice arrived quietly, without fanfare or celebration. It simply restored balance, returned stolen power to its rightful place. Allowed truth to breathe again in spaces that had been suffocated by lies and manipulation. Walter's house stood solid around them, no longer threatened by false claims or family betrayal. The legal documents that protected it were stronger now, tested by challenge and proven in court. Tomorrow would bring new decisions about how to honor what they'd been given. Tonight, they would listen to the water and remember that some gifts were worth fighting for, some trust was sacred enough to defend. And some love was strong enough to survive the disappointment of those who mistook it for weakness. Truth doesn't shout, Aidan reflected, watching the last light fade from the western sky. It stays. It endures. It protects what matters most. And staying power, sometimes, was victory enough. Summer arrived early in Tampa Bay that year. By June, the beach house had settled into rhythms that felt natural and sustainable: morning swims in the Gulf, afternoon work sessions for Aidan's contract legal projects. Evening meals on the porch overlooking water that changed color with the light. 3 months had passed since the courthouse victory. Margaret had vanished from their lives as completely as if she'd never existed. No phone calls. No unexpected visits, no further legal challenges to their ownership of Walter's property. But Aidan's professional experience had taught him that desperate people sometimes regrouped and returned with new strategies when direct approaches failed. Tuesday morning brought the first sign that Margaret hadn't accepted defeat as completely as her silence suggested. Claire returned from grocery shopping to find the sliding glass door to the back deck standing partially open. Just enough to be noticeable to someone paying attention, not enough to be obvious to casual observers. "Did you leave the door open?" she asked Aidan, who'd been reading contract documents in Walter's study. "No. Why?" They searched the house together, room by room, looking for signs of disturbance or theft. Nothing appeared missing, but subtle changes were visible to people who'd learned to notice details that others might overlook. The desk drawer in Walter's study pulled out slightly farther than they'd left it. The linen closet door standing open when it had been closed. The bathroom medicine cabinet tilted at an angle that suggested someone had opened it carelessly and failed to close it properly. In the living room, architectural blueprints were spread across Walter's coffee table. Aidan examined them carefully. Professional drawings, detailed and precise, showing the beach house's floor plan with measurements. Electrical systems and structural specifications clearly marked. The kind of plans that would be useful for someone planning renovations, assessments, or property sales. "Where did these come from?" Claire asked. Before Aidan could speculate, footsteps sounded on the front porch. Margaret appeared in the doorway carrying a tablet computer and professional-looking camera. She wore khaki pants and a blue polo shirt with a company logo, like a building inspector conducting authorized business. "Oh," she said, affecting mild surprise. "I didn't realize anyone was home." Her tone was casual, conversational, as if the previous months of legal conflict had been merely an unfortunate misunderstanding now resolved between reasonable adults. "What are you doing here, Margaret?" Aidan asked calmly. "Conducting the property assessment," she replied, gesturing with her tablet as if the purpose should be obvious. "For the insurance evaluation." "What insurance evaluation?" Margaret's expression shifted to patient explanation, the same tone she'd used when offering unsolicited financial advice during their early days at the beach house. "The storm damage documentation. From last season's hurricane activity. You can't have missed the structural issues: foundation settling, moisture intrusion, deterioration that requires immediate attention before the next storm season." She moved around the room with confident authority, pointing out problems that existed only in her imagination. "The county requires updated assessments for all coastal properties affected by recent weather events. I'm helping expedite the paperwork so you don't miss critical deadlines." Aidan looked around Walter's living room. The walls showed no water damage. The floors were level and solid. The ceiling bore no evidence of leaks or structural compromise. "There was no storm damage to this house," he said. "That's not what the preliminary reports indicate," Margaret replied smoothly. She produced a document from her tablet case. Official letterhead, technical language, damage estimates totaling $32,000 for repairs that would require immediate professional attention. Claire read over Aidan's shoulder as he studied the report. It was detailed and convincing, describing extensive structural problems that would make the house unsafe for habitation until comprehensive remediation was completed. "Who prepared this assessment?" Aidan asked. "The county's emergency management team. They'll be here Thursday to complete the full evaluation and determine eligibility for federal assistance programs." Margaret moved toward Walter's kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone conducting legitimate business. She photographed cabinet corners, examined window frames, made notes about damage that didn't exist. "You'll want to file the assistance application before the deadline," she continued. "These federal programs have strict timelines. Miss the window, and you lose eligibility for future storm coverage." She paused at the kitchen sink, looking at them with apparent concern for their welfare. "Of course, if you'd rather navigate the federal bureaucracy yourselves." The implication hung in the air like bait designed for people who might feel overwhelmed by complex government procedures. Professional assistance offered by a knowledgeable family member. Simple solutions to problems that were too complicated for inexperienced property owners to handle alone. Aidan studied the damage report more carefully. The document looked legitimate, but several details were inconsistent with reality. The property address was correct, but the lot number didn't match county records. The inspector's signature was illegible. The agency contact information led to a voicemail system that didn't identify any specific government department. "What's the name of your contact at emergency management?" he asked. Margaret's confident expression flickered almost imperceptibly. "Tom Bradley. He specializes in coastal property assessments." "From which department specifically?" "Storm recovery and infrastructure. They handle all the post-hurricane evaluations." "I'll call them this afternoon to verify the timeline." "Actually," Margaret said quickly, "Tom prefers to coordinate everything directly through his office. Fewer administrative complications that way, faster processing for property owners." She moved toward the architectural blueprints on Walter's coffee table, began rolling them up with practiced efficiency. "These will need updating anyway. The structural damage makes the original specifications obsolete for insurance purposes." "Leave those alone," Aidan said quietly. Margaret paused, the blueprints half rolled in her hands. Caught between completing her task and acknowledging Aidan's authority over property that legally belonged to him. "I'm just organizing the documentation for the assessment team." "Leave them alone." The room went silent except for the distant sound of waves and the soft hum of the air conditioning running continuously against Florida's summer heat. Margaret stood frozen in an awkward position, holding blueprints she had no right to touch in a house she had no legal claim to enter. Finally, she released the papers and stepped back, her helpful demeanor beginning to crack under the pressure of Aidan's quiet refusal to be managed. "Fine," she said. "Handle the documentation yourselves." But she didn't leave immediately. Instead, she moved to the window facing the Gulf. Looking out at the water with the calculating expression of someone assessing valuable assets that might be managed more efficiently by different people. "It really is a shame," she said. "Walter put so much care into this place. Hate to see it deteriorate from poor maintenance decisions." "The house isn't deteriorating," Claire said firmly. "Not visibly, perhaps. But these older coastal properties require constant professional attention. Expensive attention from people who understand the unique challenges of salt air, storm exposure, foundation stability in sandy soil." Margaret turned from the window, her expression shifting toward something that might have been sympathy if it hadn't felt so calculated and condescending. "Look, I know we've had our disagreements. But family is family. I don't want to see you lose something Walter wanted you to have because you weren't prepared for the realities of coastal property ownership." She gestured around the room as if pointing out obvious problems that only trained professionals could recognize and address properly. The federal assistance program would cover most of the repair costs. You'd just need to sign authorization forms, approve contractor selection, authorize payment processing. I could coordinate all the complicated details, handle the paperwork, manage the project timeline so you don't have to worry about technical specifications. Aidan understood immediately. This wasn't primarily about insurance fraud, though fraudulent elements were certainly present. Margaret was constructing a paper trail of property damage and repair authorizations that would eventually justify her involvement in financial decisions about the house. One signature would lead to another. Temporary project management would become permanent oversight. Before long, Margaret would control repair budgets, contractor relationships, and ultimately decisions about whether the house was worth maintaining or should be sold to people better equipped to handle coastal property challenges. "No," Aidan said simply. "No what?" "No federal application, no contractor coordination, no project management assistance of any kind." Margaret's carefully constructed helpful demeanor dissolved completely. The patient, professional expression vanished, replaced by something harder and more desperate than anything she'd revealed during previous confrontations. "You can't just ignore reality because you don't want to deal with complexity," she said, her voice rising slightly. "This house has serious problems whether you acknowledge them or not. Problems that will only get worse if you continue refusing professional guidance. The only problem this house has is unauthorized visitors creating imaginary crises," Aidan replied calmly. He moved to the phone on Walter's kitchen counter, the same phone. Walter had used to coordinate his own maintenance and repairs for 3 decades without requiring outside management. "What are you doing?" Margaret demanded. "Calling the sheriff's department." "For what?" "Trespassing. Breaking and entering. Attempted fraud using fabricated government documents." Margaret's composure shattered entirely. Her tablet trembled in her hands, the false documentation suddenly looking obviously fake and hastily constructed. "You wouldn't involve law enforcement over a family misunderstanding about property maintenance." "This isn't a misunderstanding," Aiden said, beginning to dial. "This is criminal behavior disguised as family assistance." She stared at him, finally understanding that all her strategies had failed. That he would not be manipulated through false emergencies or intimidated by manufactured crises. "Fine," she said finally, gathering her materials with obvious defeat. "I tried to help one last time, but if you're determined to make preventable mistakes." "We're not making mistakes," Claire said. "We're making decisions. There's a difference." Margaret paused at the doorway, looked back with an expression that showed the moment. When all possibilities for manipulation had been exhausted and all strategies had proven unsuccessful. "This was your last chance to accept reasonable assistance," she said. "No," Aiden corrected gently. "This was yours." After Margaret left, they found her business card on the kitchen counter. Printed with the name and logo of a property management company that didn't exist when Aiden researched it online. That evening, he called the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office and filed a comprehensive trespassing complaint. Providing copies of security footage, requesting increased patrol attention for their neighborhood, and documenting Margaret's pattern of unauthorized entry and fraudulent behavior. The deputy who took the report was professional, thorough, and completely unsurprised by family-related property crimes involving elderly relatives and inheritance disputes. "Will this stop her?" Claire asked after Aiden completed the paperwork. "It makes the legal consequences clear," Aiden replied. "What she does with that information is her choice, but she can't claim ignorance if she violates the order." Friday morning brought Claire's final decision. She dialed Margaret's number for the last time, knowing this conversation would end their relationship permanently. But understanding that some boundaries required absolute enforcement. Margaret answered on the first ring, her voice carrying desperate hope. "Claire? I was hoping you'd reconsidered the property assessment situation. The deadline for federal assistance applications is approaching rapidly." "Margaret," Claire interrupted gently but with unmistakable finality. "Stop. Stop what?" "All of it. The fake emergencies, the manufactured crises, the attempts to control property and decisions that don't belong to you." The line went quiet for several seconds that felt much longer. "I don't understand what you mean," Margaret said finally, though her voice suggested she understood perfectly. "Yes, you do," Claire replied with the calm certainty that came from finally recognizing destructive patterns clearly enough to name them without apology. "You've been trying to take control of our lives since the day we inherited Walter's house. Through legal manipulation, fake insurance requirements, fraudulent damage reports, imaginary government programs. It's not working, and it's never going to work. I was trying to protect you from making expensive mistakes. No, you were trying to protect yourself from losing control over decisions that were never yours to make." Claire paused, choosing her final words carefully because she knew they would define whatever relationship remained between them. "Do not come to our house again. Do not call with more schemes or fake emergencies. Do not contact us unless someone in the immediate family is dying or dead." She hung up before Margaret could respond, then immediately blocked the number from their phone system. That evening, they sat together on Walter's porch as sunset painted the sky in the familiar colors that had drawn Walter to this place. And convinced him to preserve it for people who would appreciate what he'd protected. "Do you think she'll try again?" Claire asked, watching pelicans dive for fish beyond the breakers. Aiden considered the question while studying the horizon where Walter had loved to watch for dolphins and storms with equal fascination. Margaret's desperation ran deep, fueled by financial instability and an inability to accept that some people didn't want or need her management. "Not here," he said finally. "Not with us." "What do you mean?" "She'll find other targets, other opportunities, other family members or friends who seem vulnerable to the kind of assistance that becomes control. People like Margaret don't change their fundamental approach to relationships, they just find new situations where those approaches might be more successful. Claire leaned against his shoulder, her weight familiar and comforting after 15 years of marriage. And 3 months of defending their right to make their own decisions about their own property. But we're safe? We're protected, Aidan corrected. By law, by documentation, by our willingness to enforce boundaries even when it's uncomfortable and causes family conflict. In the distance, lights began appearing in windows along the coastline. Families settling into evening routines, couples sharing quiet dinners. People living ordinary lives that seemed extraordinary in their simple contentment and freedom from external control. Love without limits becomes harm, Aidan thought, watching the last traces of sunlight disappear into the gulf. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do for family was refuse to enable their worst impulses, to say no with kindness. But absolute finality, to protect what mattered from those who would consume it in the name of assistance or concern. Walter's house stood solid around them, no longer threatened by schemes or false claims or manufactured emergencies. The legal documents that protected it had been tested by multiple challenges and proven stronger each time. Tomorrow would bring new decisions about how to honor what they'd been given. Tonight, they would listen to the water and remember that some boundaries were worth defending, some peace was worth fighting for. And some gifts came with the responsibility to protect them from those who would misuse them. 8 months later, the beach house had transformed into something Walter would have recognized and celebrated. Claire's herb garden flourished in the sandy soil beside the front steps. Basil and oregano perfuming the morning air with scents that mixed beautifully with the salt breeze from the Gulf. Aidan had expanded Walter's workshop into a proper home office, where he managed his contract legal projects with the same methodical precision he'd applied to corporate law. December brought Tampa Bay's most pleasant weather of the year: cool mornings, warm afternoons, evenings perfect for sitting on the porch and watching the sky change colors as day transitioned to night over water that belonged, in some meaningful sense, to them now. Aidan organized his daily tasks with the same systematic approach he'd maintained throughout his career, but now the routine felt different. Not anxious preparation for someone else's priorities, but purposeful management of a life they'd chosen rather than accepted. Claire emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee and a small stack of mail. She'd developed new confidence in this space, moving through Walter's rooms as if she'd always belonged here. Adding her own touches while preserving what made the house special. Anything interesting? Aidan asked, looking up from the contract. He was reviewing for a Tampa law firm that valued his expertise enough to let him work remotely. Electric bill, Christmas card from your sister, letter from David. Margaret's son had written periodically since the legal resolution. Brief notes maintaining family connection while carefully avoiding any reference to his mother's behavior. The letters were friendly but cautious, suggesting someone who wanted relationship but understood the need for boundaries. Claire opened David's letter and read silently, her expression brightening as she moved through his careful handwriting. He's engaged, she said. To a woman named Sarah. They're planning a March wedding in North Carolina. Are we invited? He hopes so. Says he'd like us to meet her, wants to build healthier family relationships than the ones he grew up observing. Aidan nodded with approval. David had inherited Margaret's intelligence without her need to control other people's decisions. With distance from his mother's influence, he'd apparently found the stability she'd never managed to create for herself. The morning brought familiar pleasures that had become their new normal. Aidan worked while Claire tended her expanding garden. Neighbors waved from their own porches as they passed during morning walks. Mrs. Chen stopped by with surplus vegetables and neighborhood news, her walker leaving parallel tracks in the sandy soil. Around noon, Pastor Williams arrived for what had become a monthly visit. Rather than the weekly check-ins he'd provided during their first months at the beach house. The elderly minister had known Walter for 20 years, had officiated at his wife's funeral, and had provided comfort during Walter's final illness. He'd been monitoring Aidan and Claire's transition with the gentle persistence of someone who understood that major life changes required ongoing support. "How are you settling into the rhythm?" he asked, accepting the iced tea Claire offered and settling into Walter's reading chair, which had become the unofficial seat for honored guests. "Better than we expected," Aidan replied. The house feels like home now, not like someone else's space we're borrowing. Walter would be pleased. He worried about leaving it empty, becoming another abandoned property that developers would eventually tear down for condominiums. Pastor Williams sipped his tea thoughtfully, studying the changes they'd made to Walter's carefully preserved environment. Heard Margaret moved to North Carolina, he said casually. New job with a commercial cleaning service. Seems to be finding her footing in a different environment. Aidan looked up from the contract he was reviewing. They'd received no direct communication from Margaret since Claire's final phone call 8 months earlier. Her absence had become a peaceful silence they'd learned to appreciate rather than question. How is she adjusting? Claire asked. Better, apparently. The work provides structure without requiring the kind of complex decision-making that seemed to create problems for her in real estate. Steady income, clear expectations, less opportunity for the complications that used to follow her around. Pastor Williams chose his words carefully, but his meaning was clear. Distance from family property and financial decisions had provided Margaret with something she desperately needed: freedom from temptations. She couldn't seem to resist when they were available. Sometimes people need to lose everything familiar before they can learn to build something sustainable, he observed. That afternoon, Aidan walked the shoreline alone, a daily meditation that had become essential to his sense of well-being since they'd made the beach house their permanent home. The sand stretched for miles in both directions, dotted with joggers and dog walkers and families building elaborate sand castles that would disappear with the next high tide. Pelicans flew in precise formations just above the water, their wings barely moving as they rode invisible currents toward destinations only they could navigate. He thought about Margaret, probably working her cleaning shifts somewhere in North Carolina, earning honest wages for the first time in years. Perhaps she'd found peace in work that didn't require manipulation or schemes, in relationships that weren't complicated by her need to control other people's choices. Or perhaps she was simply waiting for better opportunities in a new environment, among people who didn't know her history. Either way, it was no longer his concern. The waves rolled steadily toward shore, each one carrying salt and stories from deep water where the Gulf connected to oceans that touched every continent. Some stories ended in triumph, others in quiet resignation, many in simple continuation of patterns too large for human understanding. That evening, Claire prepared dinner using herbs from her garden and seafood Aidan had bought from local fishermen, who sold their catch directly from boats docked at nearby marinas. The kitchen filled with aromas that Walter would have appreciated: garlic and fresh thyme, grilled grouper. The clean scent of evening air drifting through windows they could leave open year-round. Friends arrived as the sun was setting, people they'd met through the neighborhood association, the local library, the small business network that connected people who worked from home in coastal communities. The Hendersons from 4 blocks over, married 42 years and still holding hands during evening walks. Dr. Martinez and his wife Elena, both retired from careers in public health, who'd spent decades helping communities prepare for disasters and recover from setbacks. Simple people living purposeful lives, finding contentment in daily routines that balance work with pleasure, responsibility with relaxation. They ate on the porch, sharing stories and gentle laughter as twilight deepened around them. No one mentioned family drama or legal battles or the complicated process of defending personal decisions against people who believed they knew better. Instead, they talked about Alina's book club, Drive, Martinez's volunteer work with hurricane preparedness programs, the Hendersons' plans for their upcoming anniversary celebration. Normal conversation between people who'd learned to appreciate what they had rather than scheme for what they lacked. Who understood that satisfaction came from building rather than taking. After their guests left, Aidan and Claire cleaned dishes together in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over 15 years of marriage. And 8 months of successfully managing challenges that other people had insisted they couldn't handle. Through the kitchen window, moonlight painted silver patterns on the water, creating the illusion of a bridge extending toward infinity. "Do you ever miss the apartment?" Claire asked, drying a plate with one of Walter's old dish towels. Aidan considered the question while organizing the evening's dinner dishes. Their old life had been comfortable, predictable, free from the uncertainties that came with coastal living and property ownership. But it had also been limited in ways they hadn't fully recognized until they'd experienced something different. I miss the simplicity sometimes, he said honestly. But not the limitations. What do you mean? He gestured toward the windows, beyond which the gulf stretched into darkness punctuated by lights from ships heading toward ports they would never see. Here, we have room to become whatever we're supposed to be in these years. Space to make decisions based on what matters to us rather than what seems safest or most acceptable to other people. Claire nodded, understanding completely. At 42 and 40, they'd discovered that maturity didn't require accepting other people's definitions of what was possible or practical. It simply demanded the courage to make thoughtful choices and accept responsibility for the consequences. That night, as they prepared for bed in the room that had become truly theirs, Claire found herself thinking about the day they'd first learned about Walter's bequest. How overwhelming the responsibility had seemed, how uncertain she'd felt about their ability to manage property ownership. And the complexities that came with coastal living. Now the house felt like an extension of themselves. Her herbs growing by the front steps, her books mixed with Walter's on the living room shelves, her coffee cups in Walter's kitchen cabinets. Alongside the dishes they'd brought from their old apartment, home had expanded to include not just shelter but possibility. Before turning off the bedroom light, she looked out toward the water. Moonlight created a silver pathway across the waves, stretching from the shore toward horizons that promised new discoveries with each sunrise. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to choose growth over safety, authenticity over approval, purpose over convenience. Small decisions that accumulated over time into the architecture of a life worth living. Tonight, the waves whispered stories of persistence and change, of tides that carried away what no longer served, while bringing forth what the next day required. Aidan's breathing deepened beside her as sleep claimed him. After 15 years of marriage, she understood his dreams, trusted his judgment, appreciated his quiet strength that had protected them both from people who confused volume with authority. Outside, the ocean breathed with rhythms older than human ambition. Indifferent to schemes and manipulation but somehow supportive of love that was freely given rather than demanded. Walter's house stood solid around them, no longer threatened by false claims or family betrayal. The inheritance had been tested by multiple challenges and proven worthy of the trust Walter had placed in people he'd chosen for their character rather than their blood relationship. In her final moments before sleep, Claire felt profound gratitude washing over her like warm water from a perfect bath. Not just for the house, but for the journey that had brought them to this place. The tests that had revealed their strength. The boundaries they'd learned to maintain. The love that had sustained them through conflict and uncertainty. Life didn't end just because it was challenged. What was tested and proven could become the foundation for whatever came next. If this story resonated with anyone struggling to protect what belongs to them from those who would take it, then everything they'd experienced had meaning beyond their personal satisfaction. The waves continued their endless conversation with the shore, carrying away the day's small worries and bringing tomorrow's possibilities. Some gifts required defending, some inheritance demanded protection, some peace could only be achieved through the willingness to set boundaries and maintain them regardless of family pressure. But once secured, once properly valued and carefully protected, such gifts became the launching point for whatever dreams had been waiting for the right foundation. The moonlight faded as clouds gathered offshore, promising rain that would nourish Claire's garden and wash the beach clean for another day's opportunities. Life, after all, didn't end just because it was challenged once. What survived the challenge could become the very place where new strength was discovered, where real happiness found solid ground to grow. If this story gave even a moment of encouragement to someone defending their right to make their own choices, then Walter's gift had achieved its full purpose. Your decisions about your life belong to you. Your boundaries deserve respect. Your dreams matter more than other people's fears. The house by the water stands ready for whatever comes next, strengthened by the knowledge that some things are worth protecting, some love endures because it refuses to be diminished. And some peace can only be found by people brave enough to defend what they've built against those who would tear it down. Thank you for sharing this journey with us, for understanding that the quietest victories are often the most important ones.